Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the show where we talk about literature, culture, and history in this snowy land that we call Canada. If that doesn't get you excited, I don't know what will.
It's almost the end of March and there's still snow on the ground. Let's go, baby.
Although it gave me hope, and it gave me hope for spring. I saw green grass the other day, and I was like, wow, it's dead, but it was still kind of green. It's
Oh
like,
my
yay.
God.
So, my name is Patrick, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Mackenzie. How are you?
Stressed, depressed, and lemon zest.
Yeah, so this is our last episode, our last main episode that we'll be recording before one of us is going to be an expat. So that's kind of fun, I guess. That's worth celebrating. The end of an era, so to speak. We'll see how it goes, like once Mac actually moves, but it shouldn't interrupt anything too much.
You
If not, we'll
guys
just kind of
shouldn't notice much except for a change in the audio quality, if anything.
maybe. Yeah, that's true
Me
because
and
you're right.
Patrick,
We are
meanwhile,
popping
are
up.
going to be fighting over the fact of which time zones we have to play around and when we're going to even find time to record this shit.
Yeah. So there might be a bit of a delay for like new episodes. We'll see, but we have some interviews backed up, so there won't be any like lost content. It's just like the actual
The
main
lost
Historia Canadiana show.
episodes.
Exactly. Before we get into the actual topic of today, I do want to thank our patrons and donors. So thank you very much to Jessica, Elise, Tommy, James, Belinda, Noah, Paula, and brand new patron as of yesterday night, Alex. So welcome one and all, and thank you for your support. If you want to join this illustrious hall of patrons, you can do so for $3 a month or $1 a month. We have two tiers. For $3 a month, though, you get an extra episode that's led by Matt, and it's all about pop culture in Canada, and we'll be recording an episode next week, and that's going to be our actual last episode before Mac moves. So yeah, stay tuned for that. It's going to be an April Fool's timed episode, possibly. So today we're talking about the Jewish community in Canada, or at least its origins and where it kind of emerged, right? Because we're still in like the late 19th, early 20th century as far as our chronology is concerned. And as
to
far
understand the literature of, because we're probably going to be spending a fair amount of time in Montreal for literature, and to understand the literature of Montreal in the 20th century requires understanding the importance of the Jewish culture of Montreal in the 20th century.
100%. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point to make in this case. And, even if literary speaking, it's not as prevalent in like this particular time, there's still like major cultural touchstones to talk about, or at least cultural elements that Jewish people were a part of in the late 19th and early 20th century. And also it's kind of part of what I think is an important thing to do, and that we've been doing progressively with the show, is talk about these ethnic minorities or minority communities that don't necessarily get as much play in like the overall bicultural system that we like to imagine Canada as being, as like English and French, and that kind of ignores pretty much everyone else, right? So talking about communities like the Jews in Canada, I think, is an important thing to do. So getting into it, you kind of already started talking about it, but what's your knowledge or perception of the Jewish community in Canada? And you mentioned Montreal and specifically, but like, what are you bringing in going forward?
Well, because there's always Montreal. I mentioned specifically because Montreal has specifically had a strong Jewish presence, or there's been a strong Jewish presence in Montreal. Sorry to reframe that, for a very long time. And so there, you have to talk about that just because it's like ingrained into the foundation of this city, whether it be the universities, a lot of like, not even ranging from, say, the ghettos of Montreal to the highest end of housing in Montreal has roots with Jewish culture. The food, the literature, the art, the music, the everything. And the rest of Canada certainly has that, depending where you go to an extent.
Mhm.
And I think there is a stronger presence here than, say, maybe in the States, or at least a more pronounced presence.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like it's similar because we were talking a little bit about this before the show. I was surprised that, when because we'll get to the importance of Montreal a bit later, and like culturally speaking, or in the minds of the Jewish community. But you do see obviously significant, sections, and for a long time they were called ghettos, but subcultures or subcommunities of Jewish people in New York, or you saw them in Boston as well. Like all of these coastal towns, like much like Montreal, would have had significant Jewish communities, which makes sense because for a long time, like obviously people would have come in by boat. That's why you have a lot of Irish people as well in these places, and Asian communities on both coasts, right? So all of these make a lot of sense, right? Whereas a lot of the interior, while obviously is diverse in some way, it's a bit more homogenous than you would on the coast. But yeah, I think absolutely. And as far as Jewish culture is concerned, are you aware of a lot of it that happened in this period that we're talking about, or are you more familiar with more of the modern stuff?
I'm more familiar with the more of the modern stuff, the 20th century, the Mordecai Richler of it all.
Which we'll get to one day. That's
Yeah,
an
that's gonna
unfortunate can of
be
worms sometimes.
that's gonna be 5 episodes. Fuck, talking about the literature of Mordecai Richler.
For real though, we could do a whole episode of Pop Canada on him just with Jacob Tutu.
Yeah, we could do it
Honestly,
for things like Barney's version. We're
yeah,
gonna be talking about, but
that's true.
now but again, no. So my knowledge of Jewish presence in Montreal is pretty vague for the 19th century. I have to imagine it's. I like. There are certain things I can imagine with it, of course, because minority groups anywhere don't do well.
There you, yep. We just saved ourselves like an hour and a half. There you go. Good night, ladies and gentlemen. Have
Good
fun.
night. Bye.
But absolutely, and obviously there's reasons why we mostly associate the Jewish community in Canada and in North America in general with more of a modern era, because there was an influx of immigration post World War II for obvious reasons. But that's, I think, ignoring really 200 years of history prior to that, that are kind of important, right? And establish these pockets and these communities where a lot of these post World War II migrants could come in, right? And establish. So, getting into some of the first generations, right? It is a bit ironic to consider that Montreal is such a hub of Jewish community, considering that for quite a while in New France, so obviously what would become Quebec and part of Ontario, um, Jews were not allowed to enter, right? So right off the bat, the French community kind of sealed itself off, right? So Jews in particular, but pretty much anyone who wasn't Catholic and white wasn't pretty much allowed entrance into New France. So it did inherently limit that basis. But of course, nothing works 100% of the time, including bans or restrictions on certain
Mm.
groups. So some did appear, and it's known that a certain French merchant who was Jewish, his name is Abraham, or I would assume it would be Abraham Gradis, since he's French, would help to finance, feed, supply, and keep afloat a lot of Quebec settlers in the 1740s and 1750s, right? Even though he was theoretically banned from New France, like it's still interesting that you already see this kind of this basis in trade and merchant capital, right? That did emerge with the Jewish population already in New France.
That's got to be a
Which,
self-fulfilling prophecy at this point. Like,
right?
if you
Go ahead.
told
Do you want to
people for
elaborate on
centuries that they're gonna be bankers and merchants and that's what they are, then that's what they're gonna be. Like, you're not giving them any options to be anything different.
that? Right. Like I know, and I do want to mention that you can very easily and quickly get into racial stereotyping with things like this. And I think we're both going to establish this quite quickly. We do not have any kind of hatred towards the Jewish community in any kind of way, right? Um, But I think you're right in some sense. Like there is some level of truth in saying that historically speaking, there has been a significant merchant population in Jewish communities, insofar as that's kind of what they were forced to do, right? If
Yeah.
you're barred from a lot of things, you kind of have to go
Well,
where
yeah,
you can
that's
get
how they
money.
got into the like that business originally, thousands of years ago, wasn't they were barred from doing everything else.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the thing that happened was they knew how to read and write because it was part of their religious studies. So they were the
Exactly.
only people that could read and write. They were barred from doing most other work. So they were like, okay, well, we'll be these guys then. These will be the people that will like we have to find a niche for ourselves and we have to find a way to survive. This is what we're going to do.
It's
And
similar
we're also
again
going to
to
make it
see.
very clear right now, even if we're saying these things, there is not a Jewish conspiracy out there where they
Thank you.
own everything, own all the
No,
media.
that's what I was going to say. It's like you can say that there's a prevalence of certain things and an encouragement in certain things, but that doesn't mean that there's like some kind of big conspiracy. No, not at all. Right. That would be anti-Semitism, right? To say that there's, uh, yeah, Jewish cabal. Ugh. Anyway,
Oh
but it's
no.
similar.
Shut
You
up,
see this with
Kanye.
other, right. You see this with other communities as well. For example, you saw this with the Chinese community in Canada, where increasingly as they arrived, they were barred from certain jobs like mining and so on, right? We talked a little bit about this when we talked about British Columbia. And so we have this image that a lot of Chinese people are dépanneur owners or own Chinese restaurants or laundromats. But it's like, yeah, historically speaking, that's what they could do. And so it takes a long time before you can break away from that, even if those restrictions are no longer there. So because of those restrictions in New France, it was really with the British conquest and with the settlement of the British in North America and Canada that Jewish settlement would start to be a bit more consistent, although it wasn't significant, right? For a long time, there were some, but it wasn't like a major influx of Jewish
Mm-hmm.
people would arrive in British North America, right? It's estimated that in 1749, um, at the time when the British would have had at least the Maritimes, it's estimated that about a dozen Jews arrived in Halifax from the New England colonies at the invitation of the British governor at the time, whose name I can't forget, but I can't remember. But if I remember correctly, would have been James Murray. Not sure. Please, yeah, tell me in the comments. I don't. But a lot of these people didn't stay for very long. A, because they often were there for trade or other types of business ventures, or because they just didn't like it because it was freaking cold. You saw that quite often. People were like, no, Canada sucked. We're leaving. And also because of anti-Semitism. Like a mix of all of these factors would make it so a lot of the Jewish community just didn't. But the first permanent Jewish settlement, and this comes back to your original point, was in Montreal, at least as
There
far as
you
British
go.
North America was concerned, right? And this is where a handful of Jewish suppliers accompanied British troops in 1760 after their victory over the French, right?
This is a really
Um,
interesting point that I want to come back because right now they owe their like arrival to the British, but I think later on we're going to see a lot of the strength of the Jewish presence going almost because of the French government that takes over.
yeah, in a sense, right? That's kind of
I think that's
interesting.
really interesting. They come in because of the British, but eventually they're almost in ingrained because of the French.
Yeah, and yeah, Mac has a bit of a. We talked a little bit about that before the show, but yeah, and also if we want to consider it post World War II, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Jewish people would come over because of the actions of European governments like the British and the French and obviously the Germans to like not stop the horrors that had happened, right? And so there's a
Yeah.
kind of disenchantment that happens over in Europe that would enable or at least encourage a lot of them to come here. Absolutely. And by the way, that's not to say like we'll get to it when we talk about the Second World War, but that's not to say that they were welcomed with open arms here either.
We are just like there's a lot to talk about in this period of just post Confederation, and there's a lot of
Mm.
groundwork that we need to set and discuss because Canada figuring itself out. Like where are we specifically on our timeline right now? We're just getting into the turn of the century, right?
Yeah, it would be like right around the turn of the century. The way I'm imagining it in my mind is like pretty much end of the century up to the First World War, not
Mm-hmm.
including, right? That's kind of what I'm
And
imagining right
those
now.
are big moments. The World War specifically is going to be big. So if people feel like we're waffling or we're dragging our feet right now, part of that, yes, we are dragging our feet because this is Patrick's preferred time period. But it's also because there's a lot going on right now.
Exactly. Like in a preferred time period, not because it's like sunshine and rainbows over there. I just think that there's like a lot of groundwork to cover
Yeah, I
for this
remember where we are
particular
right now.
time.
We're getting close to talking about our boys, so Wolf and Laurier.
Exactly. I'm wondering if that might be actually our next episode. I'm thinking about it.
Oh
That might
boy,
be funny.
our next couple of episodes, honestly,
Yeah, for sure. We'll have to think about this.
the Jewish presence.
Um, so basically, a lot of the Jewish community, like we were saying, would emerge with the arrival of the British, and one of the and it would be quite rapid that there would be some kind of settlement elsewhere. So, for example, there was a prominent Jewish family in Trois-Rivières, right? Which kind of surprised me actually. Of all the places where there would be a prominent Jewish family, like Trois-Rivières is not a place that I imagine to be particular heterogeneous. Perhaps that's my own bias in this case, but yeah, in this case, apparently the Hart family were quite prominent in that area, and Ezekiel Hart specifically would be well known, at least in Jewish and Canadian history, as one of the first, if not the first, Jewish person to be elected to the legislature of what was then known as Lower Canada. And this would have been in 1807, right? So quite a bit of time, actually, right, between when the first Jewish settlements would have been established in Montreal in 1760 and when one of them would have been elected to Parliament or to the legislature, right? Um, but unfortunately, Hart himself was denied his seat because of his religion. And I guess this is a good place to start thinking about one of the first questions that we have is like, what are the limits of acceptance, I guess, for these different kinds of communities? And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. But, for, Jewish people obviously had some place in trade and in establishing and helping with the military and so on. But when it becomes time to actually being in the government, that's where we kind of put the limit in this case. And I'm wondering if you have any particular thoughts about the establishment of those kinds of
Establishing the limits. Sorry.
yeah, of like what Jewish people can or cannot do in Canada, right? Because Hart was barred from
Oh,
being in the legislature because of his religion, for example.
well, I think
Yeah.
this is always going to be a large part of why, like, it's what's this is going to be a large part of what eventually leads to Canada becoming a place where Jewish people can take root because
Mm,
of Canada's relationship with religion. But at the moment, I think like this is a very important moment to see just how important of a barrier, or not important, but like what kind of a barrier religion is and how strong it can be and how that can sort of really change. We think in our modern day that religion as a mindset or as a like barrier is pretty the influence has not as strong. I was
mm.
gonna say waxed or waned, but I can't remember which one is which.
Waned would be the going away in this
Yeah,
case.
we think it's waned, but not in many
No,
ways. So
no.
like
I think
it's
it's waned insofar as it's overt, right? People don't go to church as much anymore, but the actual moral underpinnings or traditional underpinnings of the religion, of various religions, especially here in Quebec or in Canada, like Protestant and Catholic, for example, are certainly still there. Yes, absolutely. We talked about this when we talked about Confederation. Like nominally, if you look at the Confederation, like the actual act, right? It's secular in and of itself, but the language that's used is quite Protestant, right? And very Christian in many ways. So yeah, that's the kind of underlying ideas that you're talking. So yeah, outside of this, or this would actually have an impact. We're talking specifically Montreal here, but the Jewish community would have an impact throughout Canada, and
mhm. As much as Canada existed at this time. We say
yeah, for
Canada, but
sure.
really we mean Quebec, Ontario, Maritimes.
or even like that's what I'm saying, like the Northwest Territories, what would have been
Yeah.
considered Rupert's Land for a while, because what is one of the major foundations of the state eventually would be the beaver trade, right? The fur trade, um,
Hmm.
and expansion of the land. So you have a community that's quite well established as far as merchants and traders are concerned, and that's where you see a lot of Scottish people for a lot of historically the same reasons, right? Where you see a lot of Scottish and Jewish people kind of go forth is in the opening up of large parts of uncharted Canada for the benefits of fur trade in this case. And a lot of Jewish communities would also help with the American invasions or repel the American invasions of
Hmm.
Canada in 1776 and in 1812. And to the point where a lot of them, or some of them, would become the first Jewish military officers in the entire British Empire would be here in this case.
Yeah.
So quite notable in this case.
And
As
I
far
think a
as
big part that helps with that is although Jewish people are different because of culture, religion, etc., they are predominantly still white.
right,
And I think that's a big influential factor of their acceptance within Canada.
yeah, but do you remember when we talked about this with the Irish? It's like what exactly is qualified as white? It's
Mm,
also subject to debate because Italians, Irish people, and to an extent Jews were not always considered
that's
white
true.
white in a sense, right? Because yeah, obviously that was subject to debate, and it's all just a facade anyway, right? it's all rhetoric. But and it's really after these wars, particularly the War of 1812, right, that because of a lot of the military service that Jewish people would participate in, that the Lower Canada legislature would provide the Jewish community with equal rights, right? Long before actually the homeland, quote unquote, of the British Parliament did the same, right?
Mhm.
So I do find it interesting to kind of consider, right, the frontier or the colony of Canada as a place where certain progress can be had, right? Even though in some ways it's very conservative. Um, but in other places, I do find it kind of interesting to see how it is a bit progressive, or at least more progressive than some other places. And I don't know why that would be the case, and like what determines where they're more progressive or not. But I do find it interesting to say that, like, hey, sometimes we did good, right? There are some moments that were like, hey, you didn't completely mess up.
And I think that's important to know that those moments are like it is a bit of a meme, but it's also important to say sometimes like, hey, we weren't just awful the whole time.
Exactly. Um, but yeah, so by the 1840s, actually, to the point, right, to kind of lay on this progressive element, or some of this progressive element, despite the fact that there were only about 500 Jewish people who lived in the colony. Um, Canada featured several Jewish bank presidents, a dean of medicine, some judges that were Jewish, and municipal officials, and even like a chief of police. And so all these like significant features of authority in this case, or of state power, would have been actually featuring Jewish people, which is quite a step forward considering that by this point, only 30 years prior, Ezekiel Hart was barred from being in the legislature for his religion, and now there were certain concessions made, I guess, or progress made. But yeah, at some point you do have to wonder just how much of it is just, well, they're white, it's okay. They're white and they have an Abrahamic religion. At some point, we'll kind of let it slide.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder how much as well, like, because at least at this time, it would seem like the Jewish community don't necessarily, yes, they offer a different religious view, but they don't necessarily rock the boat as far as the system is concerned, right? That will change a little bit later, but they allow the system to continue as it is, the fur trade, the banking system, and so on. Like all of that keeps going as it is. So it's not like that much of a threat as far as the way things operate, that Jewish people would be a part of that. That hasn't stopped people before from barring others from the halls of power, but I feel like that would be part of it as well. Okay. Unfortunately, a lot of the progress that we're talking about would kind of change. You're muted.
Wow, it's almost like progress can go backwards.
Who knew?
Who knew
So what do you
after our
think
feminism
happens?
episode?
Yeah, exactly. So what do you think happens uh, in the Confederation era that would perhaps make certain ideas go back?
Oh, I can imagine that events, there's an influx. People are fine with it. People are usually fine with minority groups when they are the minority of the population. Not so much when there's numbers to them and they can affect real change for their culture and such, for their like-minded people. As soon as they become a threat in some kind, they become scary for whatever reason, or a threat, I say in quotation marks. So I imagine there was an influx of Jewish people from somewhere. I'm guessing maybe Russia.
Yeah, pretty much. So the keynote here, the key term here, pre-Confederation, is like there's only about 500 Jewish people, which is not a significant number of anything in this case, right? Even for a colony relatively as small as Canada. And the specifically when you were talking about Russia, like post-Confederation, this would have been under, I think, Tsar Nicholas II. No, it'd be Alexander the Second or Third
Yeah.
in this case. Um,
Still though, this is like we're nowhere close to the Russian Revolution yet, but we're starting to see rumblings for sure of these proletariat people. And when would Marx have been writing?
right around this time.
So yeah, so I can see a lot of, and again, Marx is writing about Marx throws writing off throwing off chains, seizing means production, equality for the people, which is great. Sure, go ahead. We stand a communist king, but that's a real worrying sign for Jewish people who are the people that are bakers, etc., because that's what they were forced into, and they like I'm sure they can already see the warning signs and the need to get out.
Well, that's the thing. It's like yeah, equality. Obviously, there are ways that you can kind of interpret equality. Obviously, in this case, and like there's obviously limits to that when it's forced on the level of race in this
Mm.
case, which is whack, and that's often what the Jewish people were kind of subjected to in a sense, right? And that's where the problem. Because it's kind of funny that you would mention that because a lot of the Jews who were attacked, right, in Russia at this time at the end of the 19th or middle of the 19th century in what we call pogroms, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, a lot of these kind of communities that would immigrate to Canada because of the antagonism that they were receiving in Eastern Europe would actually be the generation that would eventually be much more radical in Canada, right? That would argue for, like you're saying, a bit more of that equality and that non-racist quality in society, right? Because they saw what that begot in Russia, for example, or in other places. Because as we know from history, Jews have been persecuted for a bunch of stuff, right? It's not just in Russia in the middle of the 19th century. It happened long before that. So yeah, it is kind of interesting to consider that, right? That these people who were persecuted would eventually become major forces in a lot of community and social movements in Canada and in North America, right? You
Mm-hmm.
saw it a lot with we're talking about Jews in this case, but you saw it a lot with Eastern Europeans, like Ukrainians here as well, for example, would be at the forefront of a lot of these movements. But yeah, pretty much because of the influx, we're talking about tens of thousands in this case of people who would arrive of Jewish origin in Canada. That's where you start to see a kind of shift in people's perceptions of the community, which again we must mention is bullshit. Right? Because we're getting into like we're not talking about conspiracy theories necessarily now, but you get into like the similar type of vibes
Yeah.
that would encourage that type of thought. It's like, oh, we being like whatever is considered the majority of a civilization are going to be replaced. Oh my God, right? And these people over there are doing the replacing, even though the slightest bit of logic would stop
The
that from happening.
slightest bit of like thought put into it would stop it from happening. Or even if there is any risk, the slightest bit of thought of like, oh, we can just do this without
Right.
causing an overreaction.
No,
Like,
we're immediately going to go to the worst possible thing.
yeah, we're gonna immediately go to the extreme, and now we're just gonna have fuck. It's insane. It's crazy.
So there are two pretty like notable ways in which this type of fear is perpetuated in Canada. One is in Quebec through the Catholic clergy, right, which would have been particularly protective of its religion and its traditions for obvious historical reasons. But, as you see with nationalism or other types of things, that begets some rather dire consequences when it starts to be thrown against other people, right? So the Catholic clergy would have been particularly a strong opponent of Jewish migration to Canada. And in English Canada, you would have seen it in the likes of Goldwin Smith, right? Which is slightly different, who takes a slightly different approach, but no less problematic, I would say, right? Um, Goldwin Smith, we've talked about him before. He was a prominent writer and intellectual who wrote in Canada, even though he was British and worked a lot of his career as a professor in the United States. But yeah, he wrote an essay called The Jewish Question, very original in this case.
It's
That
always, why does it always come back to that? It's always the black question, the question of it's like, why is this a question?
because it was a societal question at the time and somehow continues to be a fucking
It's just
societal
like
question.
everybody just keeps using the same title though, man. Get some goddamn originality.
I guess at the time it wasn't that overused. I don't know. We'd have to do a survey of essays that had the word question in it and see how overused it already was. But yeah, I know you read part of this particular essay and it's going to be linked in the description. But yeah, do you have any particular thoughts about Smith's perception of the Jewish question, as you would call it in this case?
It reads like most other books of the same type. It
Okay.
like
Well,
I
what's his
don't
argument, first of all? I guess for people who haven't read it necessarily, like what's he saying in this case?
I don't even know what his argument is. If you get into it, it's more it feels like those news reports that are just trying to lay out what they believe as facts,
Mm-hmm.
even though there's some kind of bias. So they're saying nothing while saying something, and it's all mixed into a big cocktail that nobody is able to totally.
Right. The I think there's like a good passage in this case. It's more towards the beginning that kind of sets up, or at least some of the elements of Smith's thought in this case, where he says the general belief has been that the anti-Semitic movement, and he's talking about the movement in general, in this case, not particular to Canada, but it's pretty much the same thing, is religious, and that the Jews are being persecuted, as they were or are assumed to have been in the Dark Ages, on account of their faith. Such was the tenor of all the manifestos, speeches, and editorials in which British indignation against Russia found vent after the anti Semitic disturbances of 1880. Everybody said that the Dark Ages had come again, and that the murderous atrocities of medieval fanaticism were being reenacted in the 19th century. And he goes on to say basically, so it starts off in a way that you're like, okay, maybe, like, okay, it wasn't religious. What are you saying then it was? And that's where it gets kind of problematic, is that he's basically saying, and this has shades of today, his argument is that the Jewish people have not integrated properly, right? That's
What the fuck does that even mean?
they're not they don't have the same traditions as us good Protestants in British North America, and they don't eat the same food and don't speak the same language, because a lot of them would have spoken Hebrew or Yiddish, right? So yeah, like that's basically what he goes on to say. So it starts off of like, oh, maybe you're taking it into an interesting direction, and it's maybe making a social comment of, hey, it's not just religion, it's something else. But no, he just basically goes on to say that Jewish people need to integrate better, right?
Basically, he's saying they need to stop being.
Yes. But it's not a religion thing, don't forget.
Well, and this is the part that people don't understand from Western centric mindset, because the Western centric mindset is very much, especially North America, is like Christian background. And in a lot of ways, the Christian belief here is not as entwined with culture as it is in other places. And this is the part people forget with every religion, is that certain religions are not just going to church on Sunday. They're not just small events. They're not just community meetings. They are like an entire way of life for people.
Right.
And even for not super what's the word for it? It's not performing. It's like, but even for Jewish people that are do not heavily observe every tenet of their beliefs and their ideology, they still have a very strong connection to that way of life for them. And people can't get that part into their brains. You can't just ask them integrate better. It's not a Jewish thing. It's not an Islamic thing. It's not a this. It's like this. It is for them. They're to ask them to drop parts of their religion is to ask them to drop parts of their culture and their being and their sense of self. Which, so for us, it's easy to remove religious symbols from the classroom and our workspaces because we just take the crosses down. It's fine. For them, it's not as simple.
Absolutely. And it's wild to me, like we've talked about this before, that obviously perceptions of, these terms have changed over time, but Smith would have been considered a liberal at his time, right? And, you know, there's obviously problems with liberalism to this very day, right? But it's always so wild to me that this term is theoretically, and that doesn't always pan out that way, but is like theoretically associated with more progressive thought. And yeah, he would go on to just claim, and that's kind of what's pernicious about his writing in particular, is that it claims a kind of progressiveness where he's like, no, I don't actually mind the Jews themselves, but they have to, change everything about themselves to actually be a part of society. And there's obviously some like very loaded terms that he uses, or like downright racist, where he calls certain rites that they have, like circumcision, to be barbarous. He really leans into the idea of
Meanwhile,
their
circumcision then became something popular for a lot of people to do.
right. And it completely ignores the historical realities of why that happened in the first place. But no, like all jokes aside, like he leaned into like the very much the stereotype of the merchant that we were talking about before, right? The money grubbing merchant, which is obviously not true, and which on its own would be bad enough. But this is kind of what's important about this particular text, or this idea, is that it would go on to have a big influence in society. Smith was a popular speaker and a popular writer, right? And so he would go on to have an influence on a lot of politicians at the time, and later politicians, including our very own Prime Minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King, right? Who would come, ironically enough, during World War II. Guess what he's going to act like when the Jews are trying to come in from Germany, right? It's not going to be great.
No.
So this kind of, it might seem like an insignificant essay in this case, looking back of like, oh, okay, it's just classic racist in the 1890s. But in this particular case, right, Smith is noted as having an historical importance on thought in Canada,
Yeah.
right?
Well, it's
Which makes
also
it all the
important to
more
know, like, oh, we think, ah, ha, ha, essay on racism, the liberal minds. This was the people who are less racist.
theoretically, right?
And you have
You'd
to
think.
remember that the Liberal Party was not the party in power for much of this time.
That's true.
So
It is an important thing to.
So you got to wonder who was in power and what were their thoughts. And it was
Yeah.
our good friend Johnny A. McNuts.
No, he would have died actually recently. This essay came out in '93,
But right
so he would have
before,
just
right
died.
before, it was
Yeah,
our boy.
Yeah.
Boy, Johnny A. McDee's Nuts McDonald.
That's never gonna get old. But yeah, I don't want to spend too much time on it, just because it's like it's repeating a lot of tropes and things that you see often in when people refer to Jewish communities, and just anti-Semitism in general in its broadest sense, of also including other what's called Semite populations like Arabs and so on. But it's terrible. And I just want to mention it because it's such a prominent part of how, going forward, Canada would kind of see the Jewish question, in huge air quotes, going pretty much until the Second World War. And it is kind of interesting, like one of the writers that I quoted as a source, and that's going to be linked in the descriptions, right? Irving Abella, in this case. He wrote a history of the Jewish community called A Coat of Many Colors, but he also wrote later a book in the 70s called None is Too Many, in this case. And Abella was a Jewish historian in this case. But it's interesting. I do find it a good way to think about this issue, right? Because None is Too Many was a history that we're going to talk about, of how the Canadian government treated Jewish people who wanted to come in from the Holocaust in this case, right, who were trying to escape it. And he released it at a time when Canada was accepting a lot of refugees from Vietnam, right, the boat people in this case. And he was kind of making this parallel between how, outside and beyond the Jewish community, we treat others, right, in general. And he started to see, or Abella as a writer started to see shades of how we were treating here South Asian people and how we had treated the Jewish people in the 40s, right? And so, which is, I think, an interesting point to make, but it does show how like these kinds of hatreds and these kinds of perceptions of other peoples does perpetuate in, again, pernicious case. But yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add from like that rant that I just went on in this case, but yeah, we can go on into the cultural things if not.
Yeah, it's probably best to go into the culture before we just create our own self loop of fucking railing right now.
But yeah, on the plus side, I guess, despite racism, by the 1920s, it's estimated that there were about 150,000 Jewish people in Canada. Right, so the influx of the population did not necessarily stop. Again, 150,000 is not like a majority in this case, so people had nothing to fear. But it does show that this did continue despite racism. So when you're thinking of cultural impacts in this case of the Jewish community, what would you say they would exist in Canada as far as like, so we talked a little bit about literature and Mordecai Richler, but are there any other ways that you imagine that influence being felt?
Oh, hugely. Again, we talked about it briefly, but there's actually a long history of Jewish donors to places like McGill. And so that's obviously going to take part in shaping, because Montreal at its heart at the moment is a university city, and it's very mainly based on, I'm sure, trade being a big part of it, and then also tourism and university income. Like that's why we have so many bars, restaurants, events, etc. So to have a large history of donors like that is going to affect. And imagine there's other larger, more Canada Broadways as well.
Yeah. It's again a kind of ironic that you mentioned the McGill one, because they would also have a history of banning Jewish students from their halls, right? That recently came out as a thing.
Yeah.
Right. So again, you see that happening on a kind of microcosmic scale of like, oh, there's seemingly too much influence of one particular community, so we'll just stop them from happening, even though, they were allowing that university to exist, right, by funding it in this case. So very ironic, but absolutely. So education is definitely one of them. And when we're thinking of the particular time that we're talking about today, right, in the 1880s, 90s, early 20th century, one particular person to mention is Carolyn Hart. I don't know if there's a relation with Ezekiel Hart, who I mentioned before. I actually didn't look it up, and I should have in this case. Spelt the same way, might have been the same family. I don't. There's a lot of Hart. But Carolyn Hart, I actually saw, is actually credited with having introduced kindergarten into Canada. So it was a thing that had started in Germany. And this particular person, Carolyn, is actually credited with being the person who introduced the idea of having children learn through play, basically. And as you were mentioning, right, a lot of Jewish communities would donate to public education or private education through things like McGill or public libraries and so on. Carolyn Hart specifically would go on to have positions like upper management positions in this case, where she was the supervisor of the model school for kindergarten teachers from 1885 to 1892 in Toronto specifically. And she was later actually appointed to provincial inspector of kindergartens for Ontario in 1890. So again, shaping in this sense generations of children.
Yeah.
And
this is hugely important, just because the things for change is like kindergarten was a radical change.
Yeah, do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about it. I know more than Patrick. Woohoo!
Yay!
But so speaking to changes in education are often slow like that. So and
Mm,
it's often like, again, this is still a time where there would have been a reliance on people being farmers. Like, you need the child labor. So, and even for elementary school, like, people still had this idea that they needed. So having introducing something like kindergarten was a huge deal. This is like, especially because it's, again, it's a place you can send your kids. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to pay for it, really. Like, this is all part of the public school system. Or you pay for it through your taxes. You know what I mean? Like,
sure,
it's
sure,
an
sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
this isn't it's like the battles we have with daycare now to make daycare free for parents and single, like, this was
Or at least affordable. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. This is the same level of change and important. And so that's where it speaks for an economic level, and even more on an educational level. Kindergarten is really important for forming and shaping like what your path in education.
Absolutely.
So this is a really radical, important change within the system, especially in the time of the 1800s, when we still didn't really know what the study of education was. Like,
Yeah. Do you know like
education.
when that would have imagined, it was like when that would have emerged, so to speak, of like formally studying it?
Oh, it's
Because
only
I
been in the
like,
last century. It's
oh,
only been in
really?
the
Okay.
last, like, it's only the study of education as like an actual thing has only really been a 20th century idea, as far as I remember. Which is why we still
Okay.
have some of our biggest thought thinkers are recently passed. Like, one of the biggest ones people talk about is Freire, Paulo Freire
Mm,
from Brazil.
yeah,
I
for
think he
sure. Yeah,
passed
that's true.
recently.
I think so. Yeah, in the last few years. Yeah.
But again, like, this again, like, we're in an age where this is becoming very like common. So to see this happening as early as 1885 to 1892 is actually really astounding.
Mhm. And it does kind of fit in, like when we were thinking about children, we've talked about this before of like, we don't know, for a long time, we didn't know what to do with children who weren't necessarily farming, right? So we have like, for example, industrial centers and cities and so on. Like sometimes children, yes, they worked in factories, but other times they didn't. And so it created this kind of sense of, I think it was in our industrialization episode that we were talking about this, of like this fear of what children were doing if left unchecked, right? And so it's interesting to see this kind of emerging around the same time of the kindergarten being like, yeah, we'll put them, and I know that's not the intent in this case, but I'm sure there's like an underlying social idea of like, yeah, we'll just do something with them so that they're not causing mayhem in the streets, because we don't know what children do when they're left unchecked. Just fine, like might as well teach them something instead of just like have them roam around. But I do find it funny in this case. Yeah, I don't know. Anything else you wanted to add about education?
Not really. Not that I can think of at the moment, but just also note that, like, there's a long history of Jewish schools,
Mm-hmm.
and those often we can see a bleed over and changes and effects
Yeah,
between like what happens there to what happens, which I think is also an
absolutely.
important influence to understand.
Yeah. I mean, wasn't it for a long time like, and I could be wrong here, but weren't Jewish communities known for also having, yes, they had their religious institutions, but weren't they known as well for having among the first regularly secular schools that would have kind of probably had an influence in the wider society, as well as being, yes, religious, like they had the Torah school and so on, but you know, regular education would have been relatively secular earlier than other places. I don't know. I'd have to check into that, but I remember hearing that somewhere. Anyway, I'll stop talking before I put my foot in my mouth.
It's okay.
But, continuing on like other cultural influences in this case, and yes, we're doing a kind of rapid fire in this case, just because
There's a lot. Like,
again,
there's a lot, and we were going to be
there's
talking
a
about
lot,
most of it later on.
right?
Like,
Like
we were going to
that's the
very
thing.
briefly gloss over music and literature because those are episodes all on their own.
Yeah, but what's also important to think is like a lot of these are starting off, right? Because for the early Jewish communities that did exist that we were talking about at first, it's like either they were too small or they were highly specialized merchants, military men, so on, right? So not the people that would necessarily be or like allow a culture to flourish, right? Um, Whereas that would come later in the 19th century, that these kind of places would, these kinds of things would establish themselves. And so you see that actually in a, in, for example, the music. right? So Abraham Nordheimer is considered to be a central example of a particularly important Jewish man in the music scene in Canada. So
Mhm.
he would come here in 1843, and he was the musical instructor for Sir Charles Bagot's family, who was a governor at the time. And he would go on to establish a really well-known piano factory in Canada and actually the very first musical society in Ontario. So while he didn't necessarily there wasn't necessarily like particularly Hebrew or Yiddish music insofar, but he would encourage culture in general through piano factories and musical societies that would have all kinds of music at their disposal or make it accessible to a wider audience in this case. And the work of Nordheimer, and I think his brother was also with him. I forget his brother's name. They would basically uh, pioneer music specialty houses in Canada. And that would be like a major element, right, going forward,
Mhm.
not just for the Jewish community, but for Canadian culture in general. But contrast that, for example, to the example of Pauline Lighthouse. So Pauline Lighthouse would come later, a bit after Nordheimer in this case, and she took the stage name of Donalda, apparently out of a compliment to her friend Lord Strathcona. And she would win quite a bit of international fame as a soprano, as an opera singer in this case. And she sang for Her Majesty's, for the Majesties, I forget who would have been in 1905, King and Queen of England, but them, right?
I imagine their name is Albert or George.
Good shot. Okay, drum roll, ladies and gentlemen. Monarchs of Great
There's a number
Britain,
in there for sure.
1905. Word. It would have been Edward the Seventh in this case.
Okay.
Yeah, son of Victoria, of course. Yeah, that makes sense.
All right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I got the number
Who
part
was
right.
who's? Oh yeah, and he was married to Alexandra of Denmark. Okay, so not a George or Albert, but certainly a good try in this case. But yeah, so she would sing for them at Covent Garden in May of 1905, and she would go on to found the Opera Guild of Montreal in 1942 and would serve as its artistic director until 1969. Because of her work, right, she would have been made an Officer of the Order of Canada in 1967, right, which is
Mhm.
huge, obviously.
Yeah.
Um,
That's that's isn't that being knighted basically?
Yeah, pretty much. It's the equivalent. Although, as a Canadian, because we're part of the Commonwealth, you can be knighted, but yeah,
Mhm.
it's it's still pretty much the equivalent in this. But you see already this distinction, right, from one generation to a next, because there would have been one or two generations that separated Nordheimer from Pauline Lightstone in this case. So already you see that one of them is establishing the groundwork for culture, and one or two generations later, Pauline would have been the one that very
Mhm.
much expands on it and can thrive in it as a very successful singer. And if anyone wants to listen to her sing, there's going to be a link in the description for a small
Yep.
song that she wrote, that she sang, which is
The
beautiful.
audio quality is interesting and the singing sounds nice, but it's hard to understand, to be fair.
Exactly. Like it's not surprising because it's audio quality from like 1911, I think the recording was. So if you think
Really?
MP3 sounds bad, imagine that.
Well, in its
um,
own way, that is even better audio quality, though. Like those old vinyl.
is it? Because it's
Yeah,
just
yeah,
as
yeah.
compressed.
No, it's. I remember I had a teacher who specialized. I had a professor who specialized in the restoration and handling of these things, and because it's because of how it's recorded, it's better than digital. Like the quality is taken to be better than.
I don't like it, I think it depends from what I've understood, and probably your professor knows more about it than I do in this case, but there are certain terms like it always depends on the compression. Like, yes, if you have like one song on a disc, it's not very compressed, so it sounds good
Mhm.
in this case, right? But
Or it's the
MP3
wax
in particular
cylinders.
is like, right. Or however, the point is like you're putting sound on a compressed medium in this case. And it's the same idea for MP3. And that's why MP3 is kind of prevalent in this case, is because it's hyper compressed, right? And you can put a lot of songs on your iPod or but you have certain digital formats like Wave or I think it's what's the one that's used by there's another one that's used by Apple specifically, but these are somewhat less compressed and you can notice a difference in the audio quality and things like that. I don't want to say that like analog is automatically better to digital, but yeah, there are some instances where it's true.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we get into literature, it is important to note that language is also an important factor to any culture. And Jewish communities throughout the world are kind of known for two particular languages, Hebrew being one of them and Yiddish being the other. Do you know the difference between the two, by the way, before I go on?
I
Basically,
imagine
it's a
it's some level of formality.
no, well, it's kind of like basically Hebrew is a what's called a Semitic language. So it would fall under the similar category as other languages spoken in the Middle East, so Arabic and so on. Whereas Yiddish would be a German branch or a German dialect, right? So it's the equivalent of like English or
Hmm.
French in English or German in this case. They would be much closer to that, whereas Hebrew is much closer to Arabic, right? That's it's basically two different languages, right? But they're both considered like traditional Jewish languages in this case. And this is where we can get to one of the points that we made earlier, right, about Montreal in particular. And because it's kind of interesting because of the influx of Jewish communities to Canada, right? Basically from 1900 to 1945 or to the roughly the end of the Second World War, the Jewish community made up Montreal's largest immigrant community, right? It would surpass the Irish in this case and other minority groups. The Italians would come a little bit later than that. But Yiddish itself was, after French and English, the city's most widely spoken language, which I didn't know, right? I
Huh.
thought that was really interesting.
Okay.
I knew Montreal's Jewish community was significant, obviously, but I didn't realize it was to the point where Yiddish was like the third most spoken language in the city in this case. And this is kind of where you see what you were talking about before, right? This culture that's very self-sufficient and vital and very vibrant in a sense. And that's where you start to see the emergence of the term of the ascribing of Montreal as basically the Jerusalem of North America among the Jewish communities, right? Much more than New York or other type of coastal city. And you seem to have a thought on that prior to
Yes.
recording of like Montreal as like the Jerusalem of Canada in this case. And I'm
Yes.
wondering if you
And
wanted to speak about that.
sure. And again, like this is I'm speaking for at this time. At this time, I don't think like in the modern day, I don't think there's really a Jerusalem of Canada anywhere, or there's no Jerusalem in all of North America, just
That's
because of
fair.
the current rise of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
But at the time, with like we're seeing here with Yiddish or whatever, Montreal is going to be that spot because, as you were saying, you talked about you thought maybe New York or something like that, but when you look at histories of America, of the U.S. and the histories of Canada, at this point in time, as you get through the 1900s, religion is really on like the fall in Quebec.
Mm.
The prime minister or not the premiers, etc. Like they make it very clear very quickly that this is not where they want to. As my mother messaged you about,
No, but that you see, I feel like you see that much more in the 60s, but yeah, you start to see the inklings of that,
you
right?
start to see the inklings of that, and I think that plays a big role in it because of once you remove that kind of religious fighting, it makes it a lot easier for
Mm.
people. And again, and if Montreal, of course, is also a city very much founded by immigrants. It's very much like a city that's always been a place of like the flag of Montreal is the flag of four different cultures. You wish sometimes that it would remember that, but it's true. It's Irish, Scottish, French, and British. And so it makes sense that this would be a great place for the Jewish people to take root, put roots down. The fact that they had been here already for a while because of things like the Hudson's Bay Company. And so it's going to be a big part of this being a good open place for it versus
I'm
New York,
wondering
which
as
is still
well.
going to have strong, like, American Christian values as it.
Right. I'm wondering as well because you're mentioning like you might not see a Jerusalem of North America because of the rise of anti-Semitism that you see, or just the rise of general racism as well. But it's not like it didn't exist in the 1900s, as we were talking
No.
about either. So I'm wondering as well if there's a thing of, because of the antagonism or anti-Semitism that a lot of these communities faced, you do want to look for a homeland where you feel safe and where you feel included in a community, right? And obviously, post World War II, that would slowly dissolve because you do have an actual Jerusalem, right? Like Israel is a state that exists.
Mhm. Yeah.
But so you have somewhere to turn to as far as like homelands are concerned, right?
And I think this is
Um,
also like it's partially a facade because, as you said, with William Lyon
mm,
Mackenzie King turned away.
sure.
It's not, and I think like this is one of the things that's said. But I do think there is some truth. I think if there was going to be a city within North America, it would be Montreal
Yeah,
because of
absolutely.
like the historical background, historical precedents. Like I think just the fact that it is a place where boats are always coming in, and like this was where like would land as immigrants. I think that plays a
Hmm.
role in it.
Or you were
So
mentioning like the Hudson's Bay Company and Fur, like a lot of them were based in Montreal, right?
yeah,
So a lot of those
and
people
there's a
would
culture in this city that's a bit more open slash accepting in general.
absolutely.
Now, that doesn't mean that I think it really is or ever was the Jerusalem of North America, but I think it
Mhm.
is gonna be the place best suited for that.
Right. I mean,
Like there's
it's one of
big
those
cities
things
like
that
New York, but New York does not have such a distinctly Jewish culture to it. There probably
doesn't
are
it have quite a distinct, doesn't it have quite a
it does, but
notable
like when you
population?
add
Yeah.
but then you add that on top of the population of Soho, the population of Chinatown, the population
Yeah,
of
yeah, yeah.
Montreal is so like the Jewish part of it is so strong and distinct, like you were saying with the Yiddish language. So like yeah, there probably is more Jews in New York, but that's because there's more people everywhere in New York.
That's true. Yeah.
That's just the
There,
ratio of population.
yeah. But I mean, even with the like, I was just looking it up quickly. As of now, there's considered in New York City to be about 1.6 million people in New York City, but about 18% of them are Jewish in this case. So yeah, like proportionally, yeah, it's still like a fifth in this case, almost of the population. That's quite notable. But yeah, I see what you mean in this case. But yeah, getting into a bit of more of our bread and butter in this case, right? The literature, right? A lot of it we actually can't talk about, not because
Mhm.
of any kind of restriction, but because it's in a language that neither of us speak in
Yeah,
this case.
yeah.
So that's kind of what's interesting, I feel, and it fits in with what we were just talking about. A lot of the literature that you see emerging at this time, and you see this again with a lot of Eastern European or even Chinese or all kinds of other communities, was in the language of the people that arrived. It wasn't in English or in French, right? So when you first start seeing Chinese or Japanese literature emerging in Canada, it was written in Mandarin or Japanese, right, or Cantonese. Ukrainian was a language of literature for a lot of people. Same thing for
Hmm.
the Jewish population. A lot of them wrote in Yiddish. So I was able to find
Yiddish.
one that was translated, right? Which we can talk about. I think you read it in this case, but just to get a bit of context, right? The literature itself would really slowly take roots, obviously in Montreal because of what we were just talking about. Um, and the literature would be encouraged because, as we were mentioning before, the first immigrants, the first Jewish immigrants to Canada really paid attention to establishing schools, newspapers, libraries, literary journals, synagogues, which, as you were mentioning uh, uh, before, right, was a place that encouraged reading and learning, right, as a central tenet of the religion, right? So synagogues were a place of learning, and of course, social services, all of which conducted their business in Yiddish, right? So all of these were important to the development of Yiddish literature, and in 1907, of one of the first Yiddish language dailies in Canada, which I will try to pronounce because I speak a little bit of German and it's relatively similar. Der Canada Edler, right, which basically translates to the Canadian, which is founded by certain H. Wolowski. And I want to talk about this paper in general because it's considered pretty much the flagship for early Yiddish literature in Canada and in Montreal. So it would actually publish for almost 80 years in this case. It stopped in the 1980s. And There are plenty of authors like Ruben Brainin, who was the editor of it for
Mhm.
a number of years, as well as the poet that we were going to talk about today, Y.Y. Siegel, who is quite well known in his community as advancing modernist techniques in poetry while using the Yiddish language, and all kinds of essayists like Israel Rabinovich, who would continue to publish. Right? So all of these names would go on to be quite big in the Jewish community as far as literature is
Mhm.
concerned. Um, Before we actually talk about the poem, right, I do want to mention as well another place. No, we can talk about the bookstores after. It's fine. So the poem itself is not very long and it's up on our website if people want to read it. I transcribed it there. The work I do for y'all. But yeah, I think we can read it out loud in this case.
The poem?
Yeah, it's not that long.
Yeah, it's
Do you
nice.
want to
It's
read it?
short. My favorite kind of poetry.
Yeah, do you want to read it or did you want me to?
I'll read it. I'll give you a
Go
break so
ahead.
you can rest that pretty voice.
Thank you.
The worm crawls into the dark earth. The wind glitters and sharpens his sword. And where did all the colored leaves fly to? The branches are lost in their hard gray sleep. The skies seem high and lift up higher. Their clear light drips blue over the rooftop. The stillness assures us all that all is well. Our churchy city becomes even more pious, and on Sundays the golden crosses gleam brightly. The big bells ring out hallelujahs, and the little bells answer with an amen. The tidy, peaceful streets dream in broad daylight and smile serenely at me who am such a Jewish Jew, that even in my way of walking everyone can hear the music of my ancestral song and the rhythm of my Hebrew prayer. Pretty.
What do you make of this poem, right? As see, at first it starts off kind of nice, but I feel like it takes an interesting turn towards the end.
Huh. It's I think there's something interesting in it, and so in how so there's othering. So there's
Hmm.
somebody being put into an other, but it's also very calm and respectful about it.
Yeah.
There's an acknowledgement we are different, and that's okay. And I think I actually really like that in this poem. I really like that idea of what's happening here because as we sing out now, like there's prayers, these all these things. It's a very churchy city, which is true. There's a lot of churches here, and
Mhm.
here's the Jewish Jew walking down the streets, but he feels safe. He feels relaxed, at peace. He feels, at least that's my impression, that even with
Yeah.
all this other stuff going on, he knows he's fine too.
Yeah. And yeah, like we can talk about that ending for sure, right? But I'm curious like how it fits in with the wider theme that he's going for, like because he starts off with nature, right? He talks about the worms that are going and so on, and I'm wondering like how that fits in thematically with the whole poem. But yeah, it's I do find it interesting, right? He calls himself a Jewish Jew in this case, such a Jewish Jew in this case, and I do find it very interesting that they point, or at least he points to what others identify in him as particularly Jewish, right? The way of walking, um,
Mhm.
the way apparently the music of his ancestral song and the rhythm of the Hebrew prayer, which are relatively, or at least the way of walking is something relatively surface level. So it's interesting that you wouldn't think at first that anyone would identify him, but I think what he's going for in this case is that there's a way of being, right?
Yeah.
That's Jewish, at least according to him, and
Or there's a way
that
of
kind of
just,
goes beyond surface level. Yeah.
yeah, there's a way of just coexisting
Mm, yeah,
very that
I
can
can see that.
be simplified or be streamlined or be enjoyable about it, like I especially love that he uses autumn because autumn
Yeah.
so often has this connotation of the end, death, decay, but it seems very much here that there is a stillness that it provides, which is how I often feel in autumn. There's the serenity of,
Yeah. And it's
oh my
interesting for
god,
me,
I'm
like that
praising a poem. What did you do to me?
I finally found it. Yay, we just had to talk about Jewish poems, and that's what would get you to be interested. No, but and I do find it interesting, right? The way he opens the opening line in this case, the worm crawled into the dark earth, which to me brings up two particular images. Obviously, the worm is something alive and part of ecosystem, right? But the way he describes it, right? It's kind of the only thing that's making roots in autumn, so to speak, because obviously trees and plants and so on tend to die in autumn. But this worm acts like a kind of root that's going into the soil and making its life there for the foreseeable future in this case. And I think it's kind of interesting to make that parallel with Jewish communities, not as worms, obviously. That's not the point I'm laboring to make, but rather as a community that makes its roots somewhere,
Mhm.
right? It's a vibrant, lively thing that you wouldn't necessarily expect, especially considering the rhetoric surrounding them as a community that was very antagonistic around the time that Siegel would have been writing. But that nevertheless are able to make their roots in the most unlikely of circumstances, like you're saying, in a situation where death is often associated. And I think that's a kind of a powerful image in this case. Yeah,
It is. There's just a lot
I
of.
don't know.
It's very powerful while being very.
Yeah,
A lot of the poetry we read here, like it reads so much as propaganda, or it reads
yeah,
so much as just poetry speaking for its own sake, or it's very based in struggle, which is fine. But poetry being based in struggle is good. It's important. But this feels so unique in its approach to it,
yeah.
and so
And that's
unique in how it's going to talk about this.
and that's how that's why I feel like it's important to talk about this era as well, is because you see the shift away from like the what you're saying, the more propaganda style poetry or nationalistic style poetry, which just to get a bit redundant and reductive at some point. And do think like with the end of the 19th and early 20th century, as modernism starts to emerge as a thing, that you do see to start to see some really interesting experimentation with poetry and
Mm-hmm.
form and subject, just literature in general, right? That makes it much more interesting to engage with. And as listeners will see, as we go forward, there will be much more discussions of like the literature proper, right? We're going to do entire episodes on books, whereas instead of doing like half of them, perhaps, right? Because there will be much more to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, we're going to talk about literature, Jewish literature for days.
Oh, yeah. We're going to just become, that's just going to be a spin off show,
Yeah.
actually.
You've been to the Richler room at Concordia,
For sure.
which is a
I've
can of worms in and of
enjoyed my fair
itself.
share of. Oh yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah. Anything else you wanted to add about this poem in particular? Again, there's like a bunch of names that we could list off if people can read Yiddish and want to find translations, like Moshe Shafir, Ida Mays, Sholem Stern, Yaakov
Wow,
Zipper.
those
All
are
of
just
these.
rolling off your tongue. Nice job.
I'm surprisingly okay with languages. um, but yeah, I encourage people to go out and read them. In this case, they a lot of their writing falls a little bit outside of the purview of the era that we're talking about
Mm-hmm.
now, but it's still noteworthy as being demonstrative of early the Jewish literature in Canada. Yeah. The last thing I want to mention, as far as culture is concerned, and then we can kind of wrap this up, is bookstores. Right, obviously literature related, um, but it also fits in with what we were talking about before of a lot of social movements being started or being led by a lot of Jewish or Eastern European communities, because a lot of them would start in bookstores. Obviously, a place of learning, right, that was often accessible to a lot of people. And what's particularly interesting about a lot of the Yiddish bookstores that did emerge in Toronto and Montreal and so on is that they did more than sell books. There were meeting halls for newcomers who didn't speak necessarily English or French. They were places where students and union organizers could meet. Right, so maybe not the union organizer parts, but certainly like students still, I think, meet up in bookstores. I know I've been to a lot of to a few literary events that still do that today, right? And one of a person called David Rom, who was a Jewish immigrant at the time, right, in the early 20th centuries. I pulled this from Abella's book, by the way. He described bookstores basically as such. He said the bookstores in the ghetto were an intimate stage. The bookseller was not just working for a living, he was propagating his philosophy by distributing pamphlets and papers close to his own views. The bookstore crystallized the cultural and political interests of the immigrant society. So, what you would start to see is within the smaller community of Jewish people, you would start to see these insular political communities that would emerge from bookstores. Again, not particular to Jewish people, you saw that all around. But it's not surprising then that as we'll get later into the 20th century, that a lot of these communities would be at the forefront of social movements, considering what was happening in a lot of books. And what was particularly good at the time, and it's unfortunate that you don't really see that as much anymore, is that a lot of bookstores would often actually serve as library for those who couldn't afford to buy books, which is great for new coming immigrants. Obviously, not a lot of them have money to spare for books or anything like that, but they could still widen their minds through libraries. And this would eventually expand because the Jewish Public Library is this thing that still exists here in Montreal, would emerge not long after.
Well, it's also there's a
Um,
lot of libraries related. I think there's a couple of them up in the plateau.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's one not far from the
Hmm.
University of Montreal, if I'm not mistaken. So, yep, definitely. And you see this with other religious communities as well. But I feel like based on my knowledge of it, I feel like a lot of what you saw in Christian or Protestant communities would be a little bit more closed off, right? It was often archives that were kept in churches or in convents, right? Whereas it seemed to be a bit more of an open space as far as Jewish communities were. Again, probably a byproduct of the religious importance of reading in this case that you were talking. But yeah, this was like very much an overview in this case of the culture. I don't know if you have anything to add in this case, but yeah, as we go beyond World War II, that's when we'll start to like see these concretized in interesting ways in writers like Richler or A.M. Klein or so on. And for me, in thinking about how this relates to like modern Canadian Jewish communities, there's a scholar named Arnold Krupat, which I feel like very interestingly put it in this case, where he says that my origins don't explain my end. My ends, it seems, have forced me to consider my origin. And I do think that's interesting to consider, like you were saying, with the rise of anti-Semitism and so on in Canada, that where we're ending up now often has relation to these origins in the early 20th century, and we can learn from that.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't know if you had anything to add as far as anything that we said today or how it relates to modern
I think
Jewish
it's
communities, but
I think it's interesting in how we again there's a sense of it's going to sound really weird, but the Jewish culture is again revolving around a business because that's what they've been
absolutely.
their
It's a business.
participation. And it's
Yeah.
I'm not saying this is indicative, but it just goes to show like this is where ideas.
And it's interesting because it also goes against it. Yes, it is associated with business, but the fact that they're so associated with, that it's, they're giving away, it's a library and so on, it's less associated with profit and so on, right? So it kind of also goes against the stereotype of the Jew in this
Mhm.
case as very attached to money.
Yeah,
So
I think that's what I'm more trying to say. I think there's an interesting
mm,
little connotation.
absolutely. What do you think of this? I think this was a good episode. I think that's pretty much a good place to stop in this case.
I think that's a good place to stop. Otherwise, we risk just going too deep into the rabbit hole. I don't know. They make that the bagels are good.
Yep.
The Montreal bagel
we
is
we didn't
is
even talk about food. Yeah, fucking bagels.
the staple of Montreal food. There was a poll done that like ranked what foods are the most Canadian that excluded maple syrup, of course. And the Montreal bagel was number 3. Isn't the Montreal bagel wasn't that created by
Let's I don't know if in Montreal specifically, but I think the bagel as a thing was a Jewish food,
Mhm.
or was created.
All that to
Yeah.
say, like
So
we're this is like the highest peak of the ice.
yeah.
There is so
Um,
much more we could talk about that we just do not have time slash are not the people best at.
yeah, fair enough. Yeah,
This is without going into food, without going into impact on religious events, holidays, etc.
absolutely.
Talking about things
Um,
like Hanukkah.
yeah, can talk about that. But yeah, again, I think people who are like more versed in like what that means for them would probably be better
Mhm.
better equipped in this case. I guess as a way to end off, What's the best Montreal bagel though?
I'm pretty sure my family is Saint Viator, Ride or Die.
Fair enough. I can
What's the
understand
other
that.
one again?
Yeah.
Name of
There's
the other one?
Fairmount. That's pretty well known.
That's the
Yeah.
other one. It's Fairmount and
Hmm.
Saint. Yeah,
Is
no,
there
my
one on
family
St.
is very
Otto?
much
St.
like
Ouf?
Saint Viator, Ride or Die.
Fair enough. Yep, I agree. All right, I guess
But
that's
that
our
will
call to action.
decide who lives and who dies.
But yeah, I guess thank you everyone for listening. And yeah, tell us what you thought of the episode, or subscribe to our Patreon, or both, or give us a review, send us an email, do all that good stuff. You know what to do. You can go on Google and look us up and do
Or
all that
don't.
good stuff. Or don't. Don't do anything. Did I tell you about that? That someone left a 1-star review?
Why?
Because they said
Oh, they
because
said
at
do
some
it.
point in
We
the
told them to do it.
we told them to do it and they just nailed it. I was like, that's so good. Yeah, so do whatever you want. I think really what makes the show grow as much as possible is getting reviews. But yeah, that's really what you can do to help. And yeah, thank you everyone for listening. And for those of you who are subscribed or who might subscribe, we'll see you on Patreon next week. All right. Well, cheers, everyone.
Cheers.